The morning of June 14, 1944 broke cold and grey over the hedgerows of Normandy, 8 days after the initial landings. Lieutenant James Hartwell of the American 2nd Infantry Division crouched in a shallow depression, watching the mist cling to the ancient stone walls that divided the French countryside into a maze of natural fortifications. His patrol had been moving through this terrain for 3 hours, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. The air smelled of wet earth and the distant smoke of burning vehicles. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next hedge line, lay the road to Saint-Lô. High Command believed it was clear. The maps showed no enemy presence for at least 5 kilometers. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lieutenant Hartwell and his men were about to discover would not only save hundreds of lives, but would introduce a detection method so unconventional that it would be dismissed as absurd by intelligence officers, only to become one of the most quietly celebrated innovations of the European campaign. Private First Class Thomas Birch sat against a hedgerow to Hartwell's left, his helmet tilted back, revealing a face that seemed too young for the grime that covered it. At 22 years old, Birch had grown up in the woods of northern Michigan, the son of a game warden who had taught him to read the forest the way most children learn to read books. Before the conflict, Birch had spent his winters tracking deer through snow, his summers identifying bird species by their calls alone. The other men in the patrol thought his skills were interesting, but largely useless in modern mechanized operations. Sergeant William Pike had once joked that unless the German forces started hiding in trees, Birch's woodland expertise would not contribute much to the effort. But Birch had noticed something that morning that made his skin prickle with unease. The birds were wrong, not absent, which would have been an obvious sign of danger, but wrong in a way that was far more subtle and therefore far more troubling. As the patrol had moved through the hedgerows, Birch had been unconsciously cataloguing the sounds around them. European robins, blackbirds, wrens, the occasional song thrush. The dawn chorus had been tentative, suppressed by days of artillery fire and the movement of troops. But it had been there. Now, as they approached the area High Command considered secure, Birch heard something that should not exist in this landscape. A nightingale, in full song, at 7:30 in the morning, in a hedgerow that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Nightingales sang at dawn and dusk, sometimes through the night during mating season, but rarely in full daylight, unless something had disrupted their normal patterns. Moreover, the song was coming from a position where Birch could see no suitable nesting habitat. The hedgerow there was too sparse, too recently damaged by vehicle tracks that cut through the base of the ancient hawthorn and ash. Birch raised his hand slowly, the signal for halt. Lieutenant Hartwell turned, his expression mixing annoyance with the habitual wariness that had kept him alive through North Africa and Sicily. The lieutenant moved back through the scattered line of men, keeping low, his boots making almost no sound on the wet grass. When he reached Birch, the young private was staring at the hedgerow ahead with an intensity that seemed disconnected from anything Hartwell could see. "What is it, Birch?" Hartwell whispered. The other men in the patrol had frozen in place, weapons ready, scanning for the threat they assumed Birch had spotted. But Birch was not looking at the ground or the obvious sight lines. He was looking up, his head tilted, listening. "Sir," said Birch quietly, "there is a nightingale singing in that hedgerow. Straight ahead, maybe 80 meters." Hartwell waited for more. But Birch seemed to think this explanation was sufficient. The lieutenant felt frustration rise in his chest. They were behind schedule. Command wanted confirmation that this road was clear for armor support, and his scout was worried about a bird. And prompted Hartwell, trying to keep his voice level. Birch turned to look at him, and Hartwell saw that the young man's face had gone pale beneath the dirt. "Sir, nightingales do not sing like that in daylight. Not in the middle of the morning. Not in a hedgerow that has been driven through recently. I can see the track marks from here. Something made that bird start singing when it should be quiet. Something big enough to disturb its territory in the last few hours." Hartwell studied Birch's face, then looked back at the hedgerow in question. He could hear the bird now that he was listening for it, a rich cascade of notes that seemed almost mocking in its beauty against the backdrop of distant artillery. The lieutenant had survived 2 years of combat by trusting his instincts and, more importantly, by trusting the instincts of men who knew things he did not. He had a radio man who could hear the difference between friendly and enemy aircraft by engine sound alone. He had a corporal who could identify the type of soil by taste and tell you whether it would support tank movement. Why should bird behavior be any less valid? "All right," Hartwell said slowly. "What are you thinking?" Birch pointed to the hedgerow. "Sir, if I am right, something heavy moved through there within the last 3 to 4 hours. Heavy enough to tear up the ground and stress the local bird population. The nightingale is singing because its territory was invaded. It is a territorial display, trying to re-establish dominance over an area that was just disrupted. Could be our own armor from yesterday," suggested Sergeant Pike, who had moved up to join them. Pike was a veteran of the 1st Infantry Division, transferred to help season the newer 2nd Division troops, and his skepticism was automatic. "We have had friendly vehicles all through this area." Birch shook his head. "No, Sergeant. The tracks are fresh. I can see where the mud has not dried yet on the torn branches, and they come from the east, not from our positions." Hartwell felt the familiar cold weight settle in his stomach. The feeling he had learned meant danger his conscious mind had not yet processed. "High Command says this area is clear," he said, but he was already reaching for his map. "How sure are you, Birch?" The private met his eyes. "Sir, I am sure enough that I would not want to be on that road when whatever made those tracks decides to move." Hartwell nodded slowly, then made his decision. "Pike, take Gomez and Kowalski, circle wide to the south. I want eyes on that hedgerow from a flank position. Do not engage, do not expose yourself, just look and report. Birch, you are with me. We are going to get close enough for you to show me these tracks." The next 20 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Hartwell and Birch moved through the parallel hedgerow, using the thick growth as cover, working their way toward the position where the nightingale continued its incongruous song. The mist was starting to burn off, and Hartwell could see the road beyond the hedge, empty and innocent-looking in the growing light. They were 15 meters from the suspicious hedgerow when Birch touched Hartwell's arm and pointed down. The tracks were there, exactly as Birch had described, deep ruts in the soil cutting through the base of the hedge, the mud still dark and wet. The torn branches showed white wood where they had been snapped, no oxidation yet to dull the exposed surface. Hartwell was no tracker, but even he could see these were recent. More troubling was the width of the tracks. These were not from a light reconnaissance vehicle. These were heavy, spaced wide apart, the kind of tracks made by something armored. Hartwell's radio crackled softly. Pike's voice came through in a whisper so quiet it was barely audible. "Lieutenant, you need to see this. We have eyes on the position. Sir, there are 4 Panzers in a hull-down position behind that hedgerow. Type 4 models with long-barreled 75mm guns. They are dug in and camouflaged. They have perfect firing lanes on the road. If Command sends armor up that road, it will be a slaughter." Hartwell felt his breath catch. 4 Panzer IV tanks, the workhorses of the German armored divisions, each capable of destroying an American Sherman with a single well-placed shot. In hull-down positions, with only their turrets exposed, they would be nearly invulnerable to return fire while having clear shots at anything on the road. It was a perfect ambush, positioned exactly where American forces would expect the route to be clear based on the previous day's reconnaissance. He keyed his radio. "Pike, fall back to the rally point. Everyone pull back slowly. Do not make a sound. We are getting out of here and calling this in." The patrol withdrew with the careful silence of men who knew that discovery meant certain confrontation with a superior force. Birch moved like smoke through the hedgerows, and Hartwell found himself grateful for every hunting trip the young man had ever taken in the Michigan woods. They were back at their start position within 40 minutes, and Hartwell immediately radioed battalion headquarters. The response was skepticism bordering on disbelief. The intelligence officer on the other end of the radio, a captain named Morrison who Hartwell had never met, questioned everything. How did the patrol know these were enemy tanks and not abandoned vehicles? How could they be certain of the type and number? Why had aerial reconnaissance not spotted them? And most pointedly, what had initially drawn the patrol's attention to this position? Hartwell hesitated, knowing how the truth would sound. "One of my scouts detected unusual bird behavior," he said finally. The radio was silent for a long moment. "Say again, Lieutenant," Morrison's voice came back. "Did you say bird behavior?" "Yes, sir," Hartwell replied, feeling his face flush despite the fact that Morrison could not see him. Private Birch is an experienced woodsman. He identified a nightingale singing at an unusual time and location, which indicated recent heavy movement through the area. We investigated and found fresh vehicle tracks, then confirmed visual contact with 4 Panzer Type 4 tanks in prepared positions. Captain Morrison's voice took on a tone of strained patience. "Lieutenant Hartwell, we have limited artillery assets and even more limited time. I cannot authorize a bombardment based on a bird singing. If your scouts saw actual tracks and your men confirmed visual contact with armor, that is actionable intelligence. But I need to be clear in my report about what constitutes verified intelligence and what constitutes," his pause was deliberate, "speculation based on wildlife observation." Hartwell closed his eyes briefly. "Sir, with respect, the bird behavior led to the discovery of the tracks, which led to visual confirmation. The method of initial detection does not change the fact that there are 4 enemy tanks positioned to ambush any movement up that road. We have friendly armor scheduled to advance along that route in less than 1 hour. If those tanks are allowed to fire first from prepared positions, we will lose vehicles and men." There was muffled conversation on the other end of the radio, voices conferring. Finally, Morrison came back on. "All right, Lieutenant. I am sending up a spotter plane. If they confirm your sighting, we will hold the armor advance and bring up artillery. But Hartwell, if this turns out to be a false alarm, if those are knocked out hulks or if there is nothing there at all, you and I are going to have a very unpleasant conversation about wasting division assets based on ornithology." "Understood, sir," Hartwell replied. "We will maintain observation of the position until your aircraft arrives." The spotter plane, a small Piper Cub artillery observation aircraft, arrived 32 minutes later. Hartwell watched it circle the area, flying low enough that he could see the observer leaning out with binoculars. The aircraft made 2 passes, then a third, before banking away toward friendly lines. Hartwell's radio came to life again, but this time it was not Morrison's voice. This was Colonel Edwards, the battalion commander himself. "Lieutenant Hartwell," Edwards said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a career officer, "my spotter confirms 4 Panzer Type 4 tanks in hull-down positions, exactly where you reported. They also spotted what appears to be a Panzer Type 5, a Panther tank, in a covered position further back, probably a command vehicle. We are looking at a full Panzer platoon with support, not just a random patrol. The armor advance is cancelled. We are bringing up artillery and tank destroyers." "How did your patrol spot these positions when they were invisible to yesterday's reconnaissance?" Hartwell glanced at Birch, who was carefully cleaning his rifle, apparently unconcerned with the drama his observation had created. "Sir," he said, "one of my scouts detected anomalous bird behavior that indicated recent heavy vehicle movement. That led us to investigate more closely." The colonel was silent for a moment. "Bird behavior," he repeated. "Yes, sir, a nightingale singing at an inappropriate time and location indicated the area had been recently disturbed by something large." Another pause. "Lieutenant, put this scout on the radio. I want to speak with him." Hartwell handed the radio handset to Birch, who looked surprised and slightly alarmed. The young private pressed the handset to his ear. "Private Birch here, sir." The colonel's voice was clear enough that Hartwell could hear both sides of the conversation. "Private, explain to me exactly what you heard and what it told you." Birch cleared his throat. "Sir, I heard a nightingale in full territorial song at approximately 0730 hours. Nightingales typically sing at dawn and dusk, sometimes through the night, but rarely in full daylight unless their territory has been disturbed. The bird was singing from a hedgerow that showed signs of recent heavy vehicle damage. The combination suggested something large had moved through that position within the previous few hours, stressing the local bird population." "And you are certain it was a nightingale, not some other species?" asked Edwards. "Yes, sir. The song pattern is distinctive. Nightingales have one of the most complex songs of any European bird, with over 200 different phrase types. I have been studying bird call since I was 8 years old. It was definitely a nightingale, and it was definitely behaving abnormally." There was a long silence. Then Colonel Edwards spoke again. and this time his voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement. "Private Birch, I want you to submit a written report on this detection method. Include details on what specific bird behaviors might indicate enemy activity. I'm going to circulate it to Division Intelligence. If listening to birds can give us advance warning of enemy positions, I want every scout in this division trained to do it." The artillery barrage began 45 minutes later. Hartwell and his patrol had withdrawn to a safe distance, but they could see the explosions walking across the hedgerows where the Panzers had been concealed. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, methodical and devastating. When it was over, American tank destroyers moved up cautiously to assess the damage. They found 3 of the Panzer IVs destroyed outright, 1 damaged but potentially recoverable, and the Panther tank abandoned by its crew, who had fled during the barrage. More significantly, they found evidence that the Panzer platoon had been the advance element of a larger force. Documents recovered from the abandoned Panther indicated that a full company of armor had been scheduled to move into position that night, preparing for a major counterattack against the American advance towards St. Lo. The ambush, if it had been allowed to succeed, would have destroyed the lead elements of the American armor column, blocked the road with burning vehicles, and delayed the advance by at least 2 days, while alternate routes were found and cleared. The larger counterattack, if it had achieved surprise, could have been far more costly. Instead, the German commanders, seeing their advance position destroyed and knowing their plans were compromised, withdrew the entire force to a defensive line further south. The road to St. Lo remained open, and the American advance continued on schedule. Private First Class Thomas Birch became something of a legend in the 2nd Infantry Division, though not in the way that most combat heroes were celebrated. He received no medal for his observation, no formal commendation. What he received instead was a steady stream of visits from intelligence officers, reconnaissance commanders, and even a professor from Yale University who had been attached to the army as a consultant on fieldcraft. They all wanted to know the same things. What other bird behaviors could indicate enemy activity? How could you tell the difference between normal disturbance and military movement? Could this technique be taught to other scouts? Birch, with his characteristic modesty, insisted it was not complicated. Birds react to disturbance, he explained to a group of scout leaders in a training session organized by division headquarters. They react differently depending on the type and timing of the disturbance. A bird that goes silent might mean a predator nearby, or it might mean humans moving through. But a bird that changes its normal behavior pattern, that is singing when it should be quiet or quiet when it should be singing, that tells you something changed recently, something big enough to disrupt their routine. He demonstrated with examples from the European countryside. Crows that mobbed in unusual patterns might indicate a concentration of vehicles, because crows were attracted to army camps by garbage and food waste. Lapwings that flushed repeatedly from the same field might mean the field had been mined or disturbed, because lapwings nested on the ground and were sensitive to ground vibration. Blackbirds that gave alarm calls in the middle of the day might mean troops were concealed nearby, because blackbirds had excellent eyesight and noticed human presence quickly. The intelligence officers wrote it all down, though Hartwell could see the skepticism in some of their faces. This was not the kind of warfare they had trained for, not the mechanical certainty of maps and coordinates and artillery tables. This was something older, more intuitive, the kind of knowledge that could not be quantified in a manual. But it worked. That was undeniable. Birch's observation had quite possibly saved dozens of American lives and prevented a significant tactical setback. As the summer of 1944 progressed and the breakout from Normandy gained momentum, other scouts began reporting similar observations. A reconnaissance team in the 3rd Army sector avoided a concealed anti-tank gun position after their scout noticed that swallows were avoiding a particular barn, even though the building appeared to be perfect nesting habitat. Investigation revealed the barn had been occupied within the previous 12 hours, and the residual human scent was keeping the birds away. A patrol in the 29th Infantry Division detected a German observation post when their pointman noticed that the usual dawn chorus in a small woods had started 15 minutes later than in the surrounding areas, indicating that something had disturbed the birds just before dawn, which was exactly when the observation team would have moved into position. Not every observation was correct, and the technique had obvious limitations. Heavy artillery fire disrupted bird behavior across entire sectors, making it impossible to distinguish enemy activity from general chaos. Urban areas had already driven away most bird populations, rendering the technique useless. And weather affected everything because birds were less active in rain and wind. But in the specific circumstances where it could be applied, in rural areas with relatively intact ecosystems during periods of tactical pause, the technique provided an early warning system that complemented rather than replaced traditional reconnaissance methods. Lieutenant James Hartwell, who had trusted his scouts' unusual observation, found himself giving briefings to other company commanders about the value of non-traditional intelligence sources. The war, he told them, was not just about superior firepower or better tactics. It was about using every advantage, even advantages that seemed ridiculous until they saved your life. A scout who could read tracks was valuable. A scout who could read animal behavior was just as valuable, because the animals were always there, always watching, always reacting to changes in their environment. By the time the 2nd Infantry Division crossed into Germany in the winter of 1945, Birch had trained 11 other scouts in basic bird behavior recognition. None of them had his encyclopedic knowledge of species and calls, but they understood the principles. Watch for changes, listen for what should be there but is not, or what should not be there but is. Trust that the local wildlife knows the landscape better than you do, and they will tell you when something is wrong if you pay attention. The technique even found applications beyond tactical reconnaissance. Engineers used bird behavior to help locate unexploded ordnance in supposedly cleared areas, because birds would avoid nesting near certain chemical residues left by explosives. Military police used the absence of certain bird species to help identify areas where civilians had been forcibly evacuated, because some birds were closely associated with human habitation and disappeared when people left. Medical officers noted that disease outbreaks in civilian populations sometimes correlated with changes in scavenger bird populations, providing early warning of potential health crises. None of this made headlines or appeared in official histories. The destruction of the Panzer ambush near Saint-Lô was attributed to effective reconnaissance and timely artillery support, which was accurate but incomplete. The larger pattern of wildlife-based intelligence gathering remained classified for years after the conflict ended, not because it was particularly secret, but because military bureaucracy did not have a clear category for it. It fell somewhere between fieldcraft and intelligence analysis, between traditional knowledge and modern warfare. Thomas Birch himself survived the conflict and returned to northern Michigan, where he became a forest ranger. He rarely talked about his military service, and when he did, it was usually to deflect credit to the other men in his unit. But he kept in contact with Lieutenant Hartwell, who had gone on to a career in military intelligence, and with several of the scouts he had trained. They formed an informal network, sharing observations about how training exercises affected local wildlife, how different terrains supported different types of natural surveillance, how the principles they had discovered in Normandy might apply to other environments. In 1953, Birch received a letter from the Army War College asking if he would be willing to contribute to a study on non-traditional reconnaissance methods. The study, which was eventually published in a limited circulation military journal, documented dozens of cases where wildlife behavior had provided tactical intelligence during the Second World War. The Normandy incident was featured prominently, along with Birch's analysis of what he had heard and how he had interpreted it. The publication included a photograph of Birch, taken in 1944, sitting in a hedgerow with his helmet off, listening. The caption read, "Private First Class Thomas Birch, whose observation of anomalous nightingale behavior led to the detection of a concealed enemy armor position, preventing significant casualties and tactical setback." The photograph showed a young man with a thoughtful expression, head tilted slightly, completely focused on something the camera could not capture. What the photograph did not show, what no official record could quite convey, was the moment of decision that Hartwell had faced when Birch reported what he had heard. The choice to trust an observation that sounded absurd, to act on intelligence that came from a source the manuals did not recognize, to value knowledge that could not be reduced to numbers and coordinates. That moment repeated across hundreds of small decisions by officers who chose to trust their scouts, even when the scouts were talking about birds, had shaped the outcome of engagements that shaped the outcome of campaigns that shaped the outcome of the conflict itself. The nightingale that had sung in the wrong place at the wrong time, disturbed by the arrival of 40-ton armored vehicles in its territory, had long since returned to its normal patterns, or perhaps had been killed in the subsequent artillery barrage. It had no awareness of the role it had played, no knowledge that its territorial instincts had been read and interpreted by a young American who had grown up listening to a different set of birds in a different forest half a world away. The connection between those two realities, between the nightingale's ancient behavioral patterns and the modern mechanized conflict that surrounded it, had existed for perhaps 2 hours. But in those 2 hours it had been enough. The German tank crews, survivors interviewed after the conflict ended, reported that they had been confident in their position. They had moved into place under cover of darkness, using a route they believed was unknown to American forces. Their camouflage had been excellent, approved by experienced officers who had spent years perfecting the art of concealment. They had positioned themselves for maximum tactical advantage, with clear fields of fire and protected positions. They had done everything right according to the doctrine of armored warfare. What they had not accounted for was that modern warfare was taking place in a landscape shaped by millions of years of evolution, inhabited by creatures whose survival depended on noticing disturbances and changes. They had not considered that a human being might understand those creatures well enough to read their warnings. They had not imagined that a bird's song could betray their position as clearly as a radio transmission or a reconnaissance aircraft. The German company commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front with 3 years of combat experience, wrote in his post-capture interrogation that the artillery barrage had been completely unexpected. They had believed they were undetected, had been waiting for the American armor to move into their killing zone. The first shells had landed before they could even start their engines. He wanted to know how the Americans had found them, what new detection technology had given away their position. When told that the initial detection had come from a scout observing bird behavior, he had been silent for a long moment before responding that perhaps the conflict had become stranger than anyone had anticipated. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.